wrongfully accused. A black sniper was handcuffed, then a U.S. general spoke the truth. "You're under arrest, old man." The officer didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. The cuffs clicked shut around the man's wrists with the dull certainty of a decision already made. He said nothing, didn't resist, didn't blink, just stood there, shoulders squared, eyes distant, like he'd already lived through something far worse than metal bracelets and murmuring bystanders. A few people watched from their cars. One of them laughed under their breath. Another pulled out a phone, ready to record something they didn't understand. He looked like no one, just another bitter vet, angry at the world. Dirty boots, worn flannel, hair trimmed military short. The kind of man people forget until he shows up in the news. Welcome to Silent Witness, where we bring you the untold stories behind the uniform. Moments where justice, memory, and dignity collide in ways we rarely see coming. If you believe stories like this matter, if you think silence sometimes carries more weight than shouting ever could, hit that subscribe button now. Support us so we can keep bringing the unseen into focus. Now back to the courtroom, back to the man whose name no one bothered to learn, back to the moment everything started. Because what began as a simple arrest was anything but. They let him away just before 7 a.m. No media, no spectacle. To anyone else, it was routine, a petty assault charge stemming from a loud argument outside a gas station. No blood, no weapon, just words and not even shouted once. But even then, something about the way he stood there silent still made the younger cop hesitate before placing a hand on his back. He didn't ask for a lawyer, didn't call anyone. No one came for him. Not a friend, not family, not even a neighbor. He walked into the courthouse like he was walking into a room he'd been in 1,000 times before, face unreadable, steps steady. He wasn't confused. He wasn't scared. He was simply resolved. People whispered. Some smirked. A few scoffed and wrote him off as another disgruntled vet who couldn't let the war go. But what they didn't know, what none of them knew, is that the man now sitting in silence at the defendant's table had once stopped an entire battle with a single bullet. And someone who had seen it happen, someone who owed him more than just gratitude, was already on his way to the courthouse. He wasn't coming to testify. He was coming to stop something far more dangerous than guilt, the kind of forgetting that turns heroes into criminals and silence into suspicion. This is where it starts, but not where it ends. John Maddox hadn't spoken a full sentence to another human being in almost a year. Not because he couldn't, because he didn't see the point. His trailer sat off a gravel road with no mailbox, no visible address, and no sign of life except a faint light in the early mornings when he boiled water for black coffee. That was it. No TV, no internet, no signal, just quiet. The kind of quiet that grows thick and still, like moss on forgotten stone. At 67, John still moved like a man built for something more than the pace of ordinary life. His back stayed straight when he walked the woods. His steps were deliberate, not slow. His breath even. Every morning, rain or shine, he traced the same narrow trail through the trees, boots crunching dry earth and pine needles underfoot. He never carried a weapon, never wore camouflage, just the same jeans, the same boots, the same silence. The locals had names for him, the ghost, the jarhead, old sniper. None of them knew if they were right, but it didn't stop the gossip. Some said he once lived in the mountains of Afghanistan for 8 months straight without a single word of contact. Others claimed he took out an entire enemy squad from over 1,000 yards and never even flinched. Most just believed he was another shell-shocked vet who hadn't been able to adjust to life back home. But no one really knew, because no one had ever asked, and John never offered. He wasn't angry about it. He didn't expect understanding. He just figured people had their own noise to deal with. Inside his trailer was a shoebox. Not locked, not hidden, just sitting on the shelf behind the canned beans and instant coffee. Inside that box were 3 medals. 1 silver, 2 bronze, all unpolished, untouched in years. There was also a photo, creased and sun-faded, showing 6 men in dusty combat gear, grinning in a way only soldiers on borrowed time can grin. John stood in the middle of them, younger, but with the same eyes. And then there was a letter, written but never mailed, folded and refolded so many times the edges were soft. It was addressed to someone named Emily, but there was no return address. No stamp, just a few lines that began with, "I'm sorry I never came back." John never opened that box unless it was late and cold and the world outside got a little too loud, even in its silence. People in town didn't see John Maddox often, but when they did, they remembered it. He'd come into the supply store once a month, say as few words as possible, pay in cash, nod politely, and leave. No one asked where he'd been. No one dared ask what he'd done. The clerk said he always bought the same things: beans, coffee, ammunition he probably never used, and batteries. Always batteries. The new sheriff, fresh out of state academy and eager to make an impression, once asked his deputy about the old man in the boots. The deputy just shook his head and said, "You don't ask John Maddox questions. You let him walk." The sheriff didn't understand then. But later, when things got messy, he did. What people didn't know was that John still kept his routine sharp. He timed his showers like clockwork, slept light, woke early, scanned the perimeter every morning. He didn't do it out of paranoia. He did it because habits like that didn't fade. You don't spend decades training your body to survive chaos and then suddenly start relaxing just because there are trees instead of mines. Some days he listened to an old radio, mostly static, but sometimes a voice would break through late-night military frequencies, crackling codes, ghost signals. He never answered, just sat there, letting memories pass like shadows across the floor. He wasn't broken. That's what people got wrong. He wasn't angry, wasn't dangerous. He was just done. Not in a way that begged for sympathy, but in a way that spoke of miles walked and things buried. He wasn't running from the past. He had just stopped expecting anyone to understand it. And still, something lingered in him. Not bitterness, not even regret, just a kind of alertness that never quite faded, like his mind was always waiting for the next shot, the next order, the next time someone needed saving but didn't know it yet. They called him dangerous because they couldn't read him. They said PTSD because they didn't want to look deeper. It was easier that way. Easier to label the silence than listen to what it was really saying. But silence doesn't mean there's nothing to say. Sometimes it means there's too much. And the only thing louder than the past is the moment it finally returns. The trouble started with a knock. Not loud, not urgent, just 3 polite taps on the aluminum door that hadn't been used in months. John was sitting at the small table, sharpening the same pocket knife he'd carried through 3 deployments. The blade didn't need it. He just needed the motion. Steel against stone. Slow. Controlled. Familiar. He didn't move when he heard it. Waited instead. Most people, cops, agents, anyone official wouldn't knock. They'd call out, flash badges, demand presence. This was different. This was someone unsure. Another knock, lighter. Then silence. John stood. No rush. He placed the blade down carefully, walked to the door, and opened it just enough to see out a boy. Maybe 20. Nervous hands. Cheap haircut. Wearing a brown UPS shirt. Package for, Maddox? The kid stammered, holding out a small box with no label. John stared at it for a second too long, then took it. The kid didn't wait. He turned, fast walked back to the truck like he just dropped off something dangerous. Maybe he had. John closed the door, set the package on the table, and looked at it. No address. No name. Just his hands shaking slightly in a way he hadn't felt since his last extraction. He didn't open it right away. Poured himself coffee instead. Saturday. Waited for the shake to stop. When he finally cut the tape, inside was only one thing. A dog tag. Not his. Not anyone he'd expected to see again. The name, Carter Sims, blood type O+. U.S. Marines. The chain tangled, bent at the clasp. Worn smooth like it had been held too many times. At the bottom of the box, a folded note. One line, printed, not handwritten, "He saved me. Thought you should know." That was it. Carter Sims. Dead over 20 years. Lost during an ambush on the outskirts of Helmand, where John had taken the final shot that ended the siege. They never recovered Carter's body. They called it MIA. John remembered how it felt. The mission was considered a success. 12 lives saved. 1 lost. The math was supposed to balance. It never did. He didn't sleep that night. Just sat at the table, dog tag on the wood, staring at it like it might explain something. By dawn, he was walking again. Same trail, same boots. But something had shifted. The silence that used to comfort now felt too wide, too deep, like the air around him had learned how to echo. The store that week. He stayed 5 minutes longer than usual. The clerk, a man named Ron, noticed. "You good, John?" he asked. John didn't answer, just nodded, paid in cash as always, and walked out. Ron watched him go, uneasy, not scared. John wasn't that kind of man, but disturbed, maybe. Like he was carrying something heavier than groceries. Back at the trailer, John pulled out the box on the shelf. Opened it slowly, like it might break. Took out the medals. The photo. The letter. For the first time in years, he unfolded it. He reread every word like it was the first time. "That I'm sorry I never came back." He had written it after his last tour, but never sent it. It was meant for Emily, Carter's sister, the woman John had promised to protect her brother. A promise he'd failed. The silence he lived in wasn't just about peace. It was about penance. People assumed silence meant a man didn't care. They never realized it could also mean he cared too much. The dog tag stayed on the table after that. Like a witness. A weight. A reminder. And for the first time in years, John Maddox wondered if staying hidden was still the right choice. It happened outside the gas station on a Tuesday, just past noon. The kind of moment that no one thinks twice about until it's too late to undo. John hadn't planned to stop. He rarely did. But the old generator back home was acting up, and he needed oil. Simple as that. In and out. No small talk. He parked off to the side, away from the main pumps. Less attention that way. Less chance of bumping into someone who might recognize a face they didn't really know. He just stepped out of the truck when the shouting started. A young guy, mid-30s, backwards cap, gym-built frame, arguing with the clerk through the glass. Something about the card reader not working. He was waving his arms, cursing loud enough to turn heads. A woman with a toddler flinched. The kid started to cry. John didn't get involved. That wasn't his business. But as he stepped around to the entrance, the man caught sight of him and locked eyes. "What the hell are you looking at, old man?" he barked. John paused, said nothing. Just looked. Not with judgment. Not even annoyance. Just a calm, direct gaze, the kind that comes from someone who's seen worse, survived worse, and has no time for theater. The guy didn't like that. "You think you're tough? What? You some kind of wannabe badass. Look at you, dressing like you're still in Iraq, or some SH*T. Still no response. John kept walking toward the door, and that's when the guy stepped in front of him. Too close. Squared up. Arms puffed. Loud. "You deaf? Or just too old to know when someone's talking to you?" John stopped. He didn't flinch. Didn't raise his voice. Just said one sentence. Calm, measured, absolute. "You should step back. That IT wasn't a threat." It was advice, but the guy took it wrong. Took it personal. And that's when he shoved John hard. Just one push to the chest. John staggered back half a step, then stopped, and something shifted in the air that he didn't move. Didn't speak. Just stared at the man in front of him with an expression that froze everyone watching. The crowd had gone quiet. Even the kid had stopped crying. The younger man suddenly looked less sure of himself. Maybe it was the posture, the way John squared his feet, or the way his eyes didn't blink. Didn't break contact. The kind of eyes that measure distance and terrain and angles of wind before shot. Then the guy said it. He said he could drop me from 800 yards. That came later, in the report, after the cops showed up, after someone called 911. John never said it, not out loud, but the kid claimed he did, claimed he felt threatened, claimed the old man muttered something about ending him like it was just another day on the range. No one could confirm it. No weapon was found. No one got hurt, but the cops arrived, took one look at the situation, the age difference, the alleged military threat, and they cuffed him. John didn't resist, didn't explain, didn't even ask why, because he already knew that he'd seen this before. Not in a courtroom, not in America, but in the war zones, in the gray areas where decisions get made by people who only understand part of the picture. He let them take him. As they drove away, someone in the crowd said, "Isn't that the guy who lives out by Timberline? I heard he used to be special forces or something." Someone else replied, "Nah, he's just some messed up vet with PTSD. He threatened a kid." No one mentioned a dog tag, and one mentioned a lifetime of silence. And no one asked the only question that really mattered. Why would a man like that finally break his silence? They were too busy writing a headline to wonder what came before it. But someone else, someone far away, had heard, and that someone had already started making calls. They brought him in cuffed, not because he resisted, not because he posed a threat, but because that's how it's done when the system doesn't care to look deeper. Two officers, neither of them veterans, walked him down the courthouse hallway like he was another drunk, another troublemaker too far gone to salvage. The metal clicked tighter than necessary. He didn't flinch. The courtroom was smaller than most imagined. No marble, no grandeur. Just wood, old carpet, and the kind of ceiling fan that creaked more than it cooled. But none of that mattered. All eyes were on him. A few people in the back whispered. One juror, a woman maybe mid-40s, rolled her eyes as he passed. Another adjusted her seat, trying not to look directly at him. To them, John Maddox was a textbook case. Angry old veteran, probably PTSD, finally snapped. They'd seen the headlines. Retired Marine threatens civilian at gas station in unprovoked outburst. They'd heard the rumors. He told the guy he could take him out from 800 yards. No one cared that there was no weapon, no injuries, just silence and fear. That was enough. The prosecutor was young, sharp-suited, practiced. He spoke with the confidence of someone who knew the game well enough to fake empathy. He didn't see a man across the aisle. He saw a win. His opening remarks were smooth, almost sympathetic. Ladies and gentlemen, we respect service. We do. But there comes a time when that service can no longer excuse behavior that endangers the public. A pause, a glance toward the jury. What happened that day wasn't patriotism. It was intimidation. The defense attorney barely looked up. Public defender. Overworked. Underpaid. To her, John was just another number. She tried to talk to him. He didn't give her much. No family to contact. No backstory to humanize him with. Just a file, a charge, and a quiet man who refused to play the part of the misunderstood hero. Witnesses came in one by one, not the clerk from the gas station. Nervous, said the veteran looked cold, like he was measuring the guy. When asked if he heard threats, he said, not exactly, but it felt like he could do something. A woman who had been pumping gas nearby said she heard Maddox mutter something about how taking someone out used to be easier. No one verified it. She admitted she wasn't sure if it was him who said it. But that didn't stop the courtroom from leaning in. Then came the man, the so-called victim. Mid-30s. Neck brace, though medical records later showed he had no injuries. He looked at John like he expected him to jump the table. When asked what was said, he hesitated, then cleared his throat. He looked at me and said, I could end you from 800 yards. Just like that. No emotion. Just calm. The room stirred. A couple jurors looked toward Maddox, who sat perfectly still. The defense didn't object, didn't cross-examine with force. She asked a few questions, timing, position, consistency of memory, but nothing that shook the foundation already laid. She knew it. Everyone knew it. The room had already made up its mind. And through it all, John said nothing that he didn't shake his head, didn't raise an eyebrow. He just sat there, the same distant stare he carried into the courtroom, never leaving his face that IT wasn't guilt, IT wasn't shame, that IT was something older. Something people in the room couldn't name. The judge watched him carefully. She didn't say it out loud, but even she seemed unsure how to read him. There was a tension in the way she paused before saying his name, as if waiting for something invisible to shift, but it never did. He wasn't asking for understanding. He wasn't pleading, he was just waiting. They escorted him out during the lunch recess. Not back home. Not even back to a holding room with a window, just a concrete box with a bench and a sink that smelled like bleach and rust. John didn't mind. He'd been in worse. He sat, hands resting calmly in his lap, staring at a spot on the wall like it was the last thing tethering him to this version of reality. Back in the courtroom, the energy had shifted. The prosecution was confident. Reporters had started to show. One of them, a local anchor, whispered into a mic while her cameraman pretended not to record. Veteran on trial. No remorse. Possible threats made using military language. Could this be the face of a hidden danger in our own communities? She smiled, signaled to cut, and went back to checking her lipstick. The story had legs. Not because of what actually happened, but because people were already primed to believe it. A soldier who doesn't speak must be hiding something. A man who doesn't defend himself must be guilty. And John, still silent, still steady, was becoming the perfect symbol for every fear the public had no name for. Outside the building, another story was starting. Quietly, organically. A few men in old boots stood by the sidewalk. They didn't talk much, didn't hold signs. One of them wore a faded 3rd Recon patch on his jacket. Another leaned on a cane, face burned in a way that told a deeper story than any tattoo. They didn't say why they were there. They didn't need to. They had heard. Somehow they always did. Inside, court resumed with closing arguments. The prosecutor stood tall, polished, commanding. This man served. That's not in question. But the uniform doesn't give you immunity. It doesn't make your silence noble. It doesn't give you permission to terrify people. He pointed, subtle but enough. He didn't deny what was said. He didn't apologize. He didn't even try to explain. That kind of silence is dangerous. That kind of stare doesn't belong in our streets. The jury listened. Most of them, anyway. One older man shifted in his seat, jaw tight. Another juror scribbled something down, probably nothing useful. Maybe a grocery list. Maybe a note to self. Don't ever cross someone who can stare like that. The public defender's turn came next. She stood slowly, papers trembling slightly in her hand. Not because she was nervous, because she was exhausted. She didn't know what to say. Her client had given her nothing. No testimony, no narrative, no plea. All she could do was try to redirect the storm. He said nothing, she began. He didn't lash out. He didn't strike anyone. He didn't run. He didn't even speak. And somehow that has been turned into the loudest statement in this room. She glanced at John. You've heard what people think he meant, but no one asked what he's actually been through. What silence costs someone who's lived long enough to know what words can't fix. She sat down. She didn't expect it to change anything. Deliberation was expected to be swift. The judge gave her instructions to the jury with the same detached cadence used in every other courtroom. Presumption of innocence. Burden of proof. Reasonable doubt. Words that once meant something, now delivered like a voicemail. John was escorted back to his seat. They removed his cuffs temporarily. Not because he asked. It was just procedure. He remained still. The chain at his belt clinked lightly as he adjusted in his chair. The bailiff stood beside him, not out of fear but out of habit. Then the jury stood. They left the room. The door clicked shut behind them. The quiet that followed was not peace. It was tension. Pressed between people who thought they understood what justice looked like and a man who had stopped expecting anyone to see him clearly. Outside, a vehicle pulled up. No sirens. No entourage. Just a black SUV with tinted windows and federal plates. A man stepped out. Older, clean uniform, straight back. On his shoulder, 4 stars. He didn't pause. Didn't check his watch. He walked to the front steps like he belonged there, like he had a job to do that couldn't wait. And he didn't ask for permission to enter. The doors to the courtroom opened without warning. No announcement. No security call-out. No introduction. Just the sound of polished shoes on linoleum, slow and steady, cutting through the shallow conversations and half-bored murmurs like a rifle crack in a church. The man who entered wore his past on his shoulders, for silver stars gleaming under the fluorescent lights, pressed dress blues, ribbon bars that stretched across his chest like a coded language only certain men could read. He didn't pause to look around, didn't acknowledge the cameras, didn't glance at the prosecution. His eyes locked on one thing. One man, seated at the defense table, still as ever. John Maddox didn't look up. Not yet. The judge blinked, confused at first, then visibly shifting in her seat as the insignia registered. She stood slowly. Sir, General, can I help you? He kept walking. No rush. No hesitation. His voice, when it came, was quiet but absolute. You can. I need to speak. The judge looked to the bailiff, then to the prosecutor, who was now awkwardly standing, unsure whether he should interrupt or stay quiet. General, we're in the middle of proceedings. I'm aware. the man said, turning only slightly. And I wouldn't be here if it wasn't necessary. He stopped in front of the defense table. John finally lifted his head. Their eyes met. No words, no nods, just a recognition that ran deeper than the room around them. The judge cleared her throat, soft but unsteady. If you'd like to submit a statement for consideration, it can be reviewed. No, the general said. This isn't a written thing. This needs to be heard. The courtroom was silent now. Not just quiet, still. The jurors had returned during the exchange, slowly filing back into their seats. One of them, an older man with worn hands, was already leaning forward, eyes wide, unsure what he was watching but knowing it mattered. The judge glanced again at the insignia, then nodded once. Proceed. The general stepped forward. Not to the bench, not to the stand. He stood directly between the prosecution and defense. Facing the jury, my name is General Thomas Ulrich, he began. I serve as commander of U.S. Special Operations for 9 years. 31 years ago, I was pinned down behind a crumbling wall in Helmand Province. My unit was fractured. Communications were down. We were surrounded. 2 wounded, no way out. He let that hang for a moment. And then, a ghost walked through fire. He looked at John. Not dramatically. With respect. We didn't see him at first. Just the sound. 1 shot. Then another. 12 confirmed kills. No wasted rounds. Each target dropped with surgical precision. We didn't know his name then. Didn't see his face. But that man cleared us away home. Alone. No backup. No glory. Just duty. He turned back to the jury. That man, your defendant, was Gunnery Sergeant John Maddox. Gasps. Not exaggerated. Not theatrical. Just the kind that escapes from a throat before you even know you're reacting. The prosecutor started to rise. Objection, Your Honor. This is hearsay. Sit down, the judge said, not loudly, but firmly enough that the entire room listened. The general nodded his thanks and continued. I've read the charges. I've seen the testimony. And I'm telling you, this courtroom doesn't know who it's sitting in judgment of. You're all here because someone said he made a threat. A line, 800 yards. Let me tell you something. If this man had wanted to hurt that kid, he wouldn't have needed to say a word. He didn't threaten anyone. What he did was show restraint you can't measure. A kind of restraint that comes from decades of seeing what happens when you don't hold back. He turned, faced the judge directly. With your permission, I'd like to address the jury directly. Not as a general, as a man who's alive because of the man you're about to convict. The judge looked down, then back up. Permission granted. Ulrich walked forward, slow and deliberate, until he was just a few feet from the box. You wonder why he didn't defend himself? Why he didn't explain? Because he's tired. Tired of being misunderstood. Tired of a world that asks for sacrifices, then forgets who made them. He's not dangerous. He's not broken. He's just done. And still, he showed up here. On time. Alone. Dignified. Not because he respects the system, but because he respects you. Enough to let you make a choice. Even if it fails him. And then, in front of the judge, the jury, the reporters, and the man who saved his life, General Thomas Ulrich dropped to one knee. He didn't do it with theatrics. He didn't cry. He didn't raise his voice. He just knelt as an apology. Not for his own sins, but for a system that had forgotten how to listen. And for a moment, the world stopped. He didn't ask permission to speak. He didn't come to defend. He came to remember. General Thomas Ulrich stood in the middle of the courtroom, not as a witness, not as part of the defense team, not even as someone on a record. He stood as a man who owed another man a life. The silence that filled the room wasn't courtroom silence. It wasn't respectful. It was stunned. Like everyone in the room suddenly understood they were about to hear something that wasn't supposed to be spoken in places like this. Too raw, too honest, too real for polished wood and legalese. Ulrich didn't look at the cameras, didn't glance at the press. He looked at the jury and spoke with a calm that cut deeper than any raised voice ever could. 30 years ago, I was a field commander in Helmand Province. We were embedded deep in a hostile area. Intel failed. We walked straight into a kill zone. Half my men were down. Communications were useless. I had 2 medics trying to stop the bleeding and no cover worth anything. Then, without warning, targets started dropping. No noise. No chaos. Just clean, controlled shots. One by one, the threat disappeared. 12 men. 12 rounds. Less than 5 minutes. He paused, scanning the faces in front of him. No one blinked. That last shot, I still remember it. 936 yards, through a crumbling window frame. Target was on the move, wind cross-cutting from the east. That shot saved me. Saved my men. The sniper didn't wait for thanks. Didn't stick around for glory. He vanished. We didn't know who he was until much later. But that man, the one who made it possible for us to come home, was Gunnery Sergeant John Maddox. The jury looked at Maddox again, but this time not like a threat. Like a puzzle they'd been solving backward. I've read the charges against him, the general continued. And I don't dispute the facts. A man said he felt threatened. That's not nothing. But feelings aren't facts. What's missing here isn't a defense, it's a context. You're looking at a man who didn't say much because men like him never needed to. They didn't waste breath in combat. They don't waste it in court. He stepped closer to the jury box, never once raising his voice that you've been told he's dangerous. I won't argue that. He is. But not to you. Not to that kid at the gas station. He's dangerous in the way a scalpel is dangerous when used right. With control. With purpose. This man doesn't need to prove restraint. His entire life has been restraint point when the jurors wiped a tear. The prosecutor tried to speak, but the judge shut it down with a single raised hand. And then Ulrich turned back to John. For a long second, he just looked at him. Not as a defendant. Not as a soldier. But as something more permanent. I don't know why he never told anyone. I don't know why he let it get this far. Maybe he's tired. Maybe he just stopped believing that people listen. But I couldn't let this go without standing here and saying it. He saved my life. He didn't ask for recognition then. He wouldn't ask for it now. But someone had to speak. And he did something no one expected. He stepped back. Then slowly, with full awareness of what it meant, dropped to one knee in front of Maddox. Not in submission. In respect. In apology. For a country that had used him, forgotten him, and now judged him for doing exactly what they trained him to do. Survive. No one moved. N01 breathed. The judge's gavel rested in her hand, but she didn't lift it. The jury sat frozen. John didn't blink. And for the first time in decades, something in the air shifted. Not pity, not sympathy, but truth. No one spoke for nearly 30 seconds after General Ulrich dropped to one knee. It wasn't just respect holding the room still. It was the shock of seeing something sacred happen where they expected paperwork. The jury sat motionless, caught between protocol and humanity. The prosecutor looked toward the judge as if waiting for her to intervene, but even she didn't know what to say. Her hand hovered above the gavel, then fell to her lap instead. General Ulrich slowly stood, met John's eyes again, and gave him a short nod. No apologie, no théâtrix, just acknowledgement. The kind soldiers never verbalized but always understood. The judge cleared her throat. It cracked slightly. General, thank you. That will be enough. Her voice was softer now. No longer performative, no longer detached. Just human. Ulrich gave a slight bow of the head, then stepped back to the rear of the courtroom. He didn't leave. He didn't sit. He just stood with his hands behind his back like he was standing watch again. John didn't move either. Didn't look around the room for validation. Didn't offer any reaction at all. His silence had never been about indifference. It was about discipline, about knowing there's a right time to speak, and more importantly, a right time to say nothing. The judge looked down at her bench. Given the unique nature of this testimony and the context it provides, I believe this court is compelled to reconsider how it proceeds. I will allow the jury to continue deliberations, or, if the prosecution chooses to withdraw the case, I will honor that decision. The prosecutor blinked, caught off guard. He wasn't used to losing control of the room, especially not to a man who hadn't been called, hadn't submitted evidence, hadn't even appeared on the docket. But something in the way people were looking at him now, reporters, jurors, even the bailiff, told him the momentum had shifted. He cleared his throat. The state will defer to the court, which was a long way of saying, we're done here. The judge nodded. She turned to the jury box. Given what you've just witnessed, and the lack of desire from the state to proceed further, all charges are hereby dismissed. The sound of the gavel was softer than anyone expected, not because the judge meant it to be, but because everything else in the room had grown impossibly quiet. The chains on John's belt were unhooked. This time, the bailiff's hands were careful, not clinical, not forceful, deliberate, almost reverent. John stood, but he didn't rush to leave, didn't make eye contact, just turned toward the exit and began walking down the aisle as the crowd parted around him. Each step seemed heavier than the last, not because he was burdened, but because he was walking out of something that had tried for years to keep him inside. Outside the courtroom, the air felt different, clean, real. A small group of veterans stood at attention as he passed. One saluted, another placed his hand over his heart, and no one said a word. They didn't have to. John walked past them, past the cameras that were suddenly too quiet to shout questions, past the general who had stood back and let the truth do the work. For the first time in years, he looked not like a ghost, but like a man coming back from a war no one else knew he was still fighting. Sometimes justice doesn't come from the law. Sometimes it comes from memory. And sometimes it walks into a courtroom wearing 4 stars, not to command, but to remind the world who they've chosen to forget. The moment the courtroom gave General Thomas Ulrich permission to speak, everything changed. Not visibly, not dramatically, but something underneath. Like the foundation of the room had shifted and everyone felt it, even if they didn't know what to call it. He stood beside the defense table, eyes scanning faces that moments earlier were convinced they were about to convict a man they'd already decided didn't matter. But Ulrich wasn't there to save John Maddox. He was there to remember him, and to make sure everyone else did too. He didn't begin with apologies. He didn't start with rank or years of service. He opened with a moment no one in that room had lived through except him. Helmand Province, he said. Early 2004. We were cut off. His voice was calm, unforced, but deliberate, like every syllable had passed through years of silence before finally reaching this moment. Ambush came just after sunrise. Close quarters. No combs. No extraction window. I had 6 men alive, 2 critical, and nowhere to go. We were trapped behind a concrete barrier that was already falling apart. There was no cover left. Every time someone moved, they got pinned again. We were 1 minute from being overrun. He looked at Maddox, then back to the jury, and then it stopped. Not all at once. Not with a roar. With precision. With patience. 1 target at a time. The room didn't blink that we didn't know where the shots were coming from. Just that they were clean. Professional. Unmistakable. 12 men went down before any of us moved. Not a wasted bullet. Not a second guess. And the last one, he was on a rooftop, spotting for the rest. Almost a kilometer out. Wind cross-cutting between buildings. Moving target. And the shot dropped in mid-turn. That shot was impossible. He didn't let the words hang like theater. He wasn't performing. He was simply remembering out loud for the first time. Someone cleared us a path that day. Not with tanks. Not with orders. Just with discipline and aim. That someone was Gunnery Sergeant John Maddox. The jury turned as one to look at him. No longer like a defendant, but like something else they hadn't named yet. Maddox didn't shift. Didn't acknowledge the attention. His stillness wasn't pride. It was control. It was habit. It was what had kept him alive in places no one in that room could pronounce. Ulrich continued, now facing the judge. I never got the chance to thank him. Didn't even know his name until 5 years later when I read an old commendation in an internal memo. It listed the sniper unit assigned to that area during the window of operations. He wasn't even on the active list. No write-up. No celebración. Just a single line marked intervention confirmed. No iniciales. No follow-up. He exhaled softly. When I found out it was him, he was already off the grid. I sent letters. Nothing came back. I figured that was the end of it. Until I saw his name last week, next to words like unstable and aggressive. Next to a mugshot taken without context. That's when I booked a flight. That's why I'm here. The judge looked like she wanted to speak, but couldn't find the right words. Her hands gripped the edge of her bench. Her eyes locked on Maddox. But still, he didn't move. He didn't ask for anything. He hadn't since the beginning. Ulrich turned to the jury now. I don't know what you heard in this courtroom. I don't know what you believe about what was said at that gas station. But I do know what kind of man chooses silence over self-defense. What kind of man carries history like it's a burden and not a trophy? What kind of man would rather be misunderstood than become a spectacle? He paused, then lowered his voice. Silence is not guilt. Sometimes silence is a shield. And this man has been shielding this country longer than most of us have been paying attention. Then he stepped forward. The space between him and Maddox wasn't wide, but it felt like a mile. A distance measured in lost time, unspoken memories, and the quiet erosion of public gratitude. He didn't ask permission, that he didn't signal intention, that he simply dropped to one knee. The courtroom didn't gasp. It exhaled, like the room had been holding its breath since Maddox walked in, and only now remembered how to breathe. General Ulrich didn't kneel like a man surrendering. He wasn't begging for mercy, and he wasn't pleading for Maddox's forgiveness. He was acknowledging something heavier, that somewhere along the line, they had let him fall out of memory. And now it was too late to fix it the right way. So this would have to do. A gesture, not of apology, not of accountability. He stayed there, head bowed. Hand still. Maddox didn't move, didn't flinch, but his jaw clenched barely. The room didn't see it, but the general did. Then Maddox stood, walked forward. He didn't help Ulrich up. He didn't offer a dramatic nod or a speech. He did something simpler. He extended his hand. Ulrich took it. They stood there for a second. Just two men, one kneeling, one reaching. The past caught between them like a weight they both knew too well. The judge spoke. Her voice shook. In light of this sworn testimony, she said slowly, and the extraordinary circumstances and context that have now been made evident to this court, all charges against the defendant are hereby dismissed. She dropped the gavel. Not with anger, not with finality, with respect. Maddox let go of the general's hand. Turned. The bailiff had already unlocked the restraints. No one touched him this time. No one guided him. He walked alone. Not fast. Not triumphant. Just forward, and no one stopped him. Maddox walked down the center aisle like it wasn't a courtroom. Like it wasn't about verdicts or rules or judges. He walked like he always had. Measured, focused, silent. And this time, no one dared to misread that silence. No one called it cold. No one whispered unstable. They didn't have the vocabulary anymore. Not after what they'd just seen. The room stayed standing. Not because of tradition. Not because of respect for the court. Because no one knew how to sit down after watching a four-star general drop to one knee in front of a man they'd almost convicted without asking a single real question. Outside the courtroom, the hallway had changed. Word had spread fast. Veterans, older men, some in worn hats, some just in silence, stood lining the exit path. They didn't block the way. They didn't salute. They didn't reach out. They just stood still, hands clasped or arms behind their backs. One of them, a Marine from a different war, nodded once. Nothing theatrical, just a signal, a recognition. Maddox didn't stop. He didn't slow down. He didn't make eye contact. He didn't need to. That moment wasn't about being seen anymore. It was about being understood. And for the first time in years, the understanding didn't come from a file or a rumor or a guess. It came from a man who knew. Behind him, General Ulrich followed. Not as a leader, not as an officer, as a witness. To ensure the country that forgot Maddox saw him, fully, finally, and clearly, as he left that courtroom. Outside, a reporter tried to ask a question, but froze before the words landed. The camera guy lowered the lens. Something about the moment refused to be reduced to a soundbite. There was no headline that would do it justice. No phrasing that wouldn't cheapen it. So instead, the story walked past them. Maddox stepped out into the light. The sun hit different. Not brighter. Not symbolic. Just real. No filters. No metaphor. Just a man, with boots older than most of the people now writing policy, walking into daylight without asking for permission. He didn't stop for interviews. He didn't turn around. He just kept walking. And for the first time in a very long time, the world didn't talk over his silence. It let it speak. Later that day, the press tried to find him. Called him a decorated veteran, cleared of all charges. They printed phrases like forgotten hero and silent sniper saves honor in final hour. They got the words wrong. Not because they didn't try, but because there are some lives you don't summarize. Some men don't fit inside a paragraph. Maddox wasn't a story to be filed. He was a truth people hadn't been willing to hear until someone said it loud enough in the right uniform. General Ulrich didn't go home right away. He stayed an extra day, visited a few of the veterans who'd shown up that morning. Quiet conversations. No comidas. He didn't talk about Maddox unless someone else brought it up. And even then, he said the same thing every time. He shouldn't have needed me to speak. Maddox didn't return to the courthouse. Didn't give a quote. Didn't leave a statement. The only evidence he was ever there was a dismissed file, an empty seat, and the faint memory of a man walking out without a sound. But the kneel, they remembered that. That image lasted longer than any transcript. Not because it was dramatic, because it was overdue. The courtroom emptied, but no one rushed to the door. People filed out slowly, not because they didn't have somewhere else to be, but because they weren't sure how to carry what had just happened. The verdict wasn't just a dismissal, it was a correction. A delayed recognition that some debts aren't owed in money or punishment, but in memory. No one said it out loud, but they all knew. The system didn't set John Maddox free. It simply stepped out of his way. He walked out of that courtroom the same way he walked in. No aplausos, no expression, the same worn boots, the same silence. But this time, it wasn't misunderstood. It wasn't threatening. It wasn't dismissed. It was respected. There was no escort. No parade. Just General Ulrich walking behind him, not leading, not protecting, just witnessing. One man following another, because sometimes that's how history gets rewritten, not with speeches, but with presence. Outside, the veterans stood, not because they were told to, not because someone organized a welcome. They stood because something in them knew what had just happened mattered. Not in headlines, not in politics, but in principle. Some saluted, some didn't. One of them, maybe 60, maybe 70, had tears in his eyes. Not loud tears, not dramatic, just quiet ones. The kind you can only carry after years of watching people forget what they once promised to remember. Maddox didn't acknowledge the cameras. He didn't stop to speak. But for the first time, the press didn't shout questions. They didn't push forward. They just let him pass. Because deep down, even they knew the story didn't belong to them. It never did. There was no homecoming banner. No dramatic fade to black. Just the sound of boots against pavement and a man walking alone, as he always had, but no longer misunderstood. Maddox didn't want redemption. He didn't ask for it. He didn't need the charges dropped to know who he was. But now, finally, the world paused long enough to see it too. He wasn't a relic. He wasn't a threat. He was proof that some men serve long after they hang up the uniform. That silence isn't retreat. It's endurance. He didn't celebrate. He didn't linger. He drove back to the edge of town, to the trailer no one had visited in years. But something had changed. Not the place. The weight. For the first time, the burden wasn't entirely his to carry. Someone had spoken. Someone had remembered. And that changed everything. John Maddox never talked about what happened that day. Not to neighbors. Not to the press. Not even to the men who stood at attention as he walked past. But the story traveled anyway. Not because he told it, but because for once others finally did. You won't find his name in textbooks. There's no holiday for what he endured. But you'll find it whispered in VA clinics, mentioned at fire pits during reunions, passed between men who know the cost of survival. And if you listen closely, you'll hear the shift. That slight change in how we speak about men like him. Because when the war ends, it doesn't end for everyone. And sometimes the quietest man in the room is the one who's been holding everything together all along. And maybe, just maybe, that's the lesson. Not to wait until it's too late to see what someone's carried. Not to mistake silence for surrender. Not to call a man broken just because he never asks to be fixed. If this story meant something to you, if you know someone like John Maddox, someone who never asked for applause but always deserved it, let us know in the comments. Tell us who they are, what they meant to you, and how you remember them. These stories don't spread by accident. They spread because people like you keep them alive. And if you believe stories like this matter, stories about honor, restraint, and the kind of strength that doesn't need a spotlight, subscribe to the channel. Share it, because someone out there is still walking alone. And maybe it's time we walked a little closer. We'll see you in the next one.